You need to put up the test pattern for technical difficulties.
Oh yeah, I tested it all. Yeah.
If so, use the one with the Native American on it. It's classic.
There we go.
Can you log on and check?
Okay, we're going?
Yeah.
Are we?
Now that I think about it, I don't think I've ever seen a YouTube live stream
Yes, no?
with landscape. Yeah.
Are we live?
We are live, Father.
Oh, okay. I was waiting for that big over-exaggerated 5. Yeah. So let's go ahead and start with a word of prayer. Now that you've got it all lined up, I'm going to stand up. O Heavenly King, the Comforter, the Spirit of Truth, who art in all places and fillest all things, treasury of good things and giver of life, come and dwell in us, cleanse us every stain, and save our souls, O gracious Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Someone has snuck into the men's Bible study also.
Good.
I don't mind.
You don't mind?
I don't mind. I don't mind.
Anybody mind?
They're just going to have better manners than they usually do. That's the only issue. Okay, so we'll go ahead here in just a minute and get started. I think we'll still have some people trickling in. I don't know if any of you have noticed this, but sometimes Orthodox people show up a little late for things. Is that experience you've had too? Okay. But when we get started in just a moment, we're actually picking up at the beginning of the book of Deuteronomy. We're working through the life of Moses. So we're not going to be going through all of Deuteronomy verse by verse, but we're going to be going through significant chunks of it. And to sort of get us caught up, because it's been, even if you've been following this Bible study very faithfully, it's been a month. We're at literally right at the end of Moses' life when we start the book of Deuteronomy, because what the book of Deuteronomy is fundamentally different than Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers that we've gone through previously as we've been tracing through Moses' life. Because while those have been different things, so Exodus we saw was mostly narrative, mostly telling the story of Moses' life and the early life of the people of Israel. Leviticus, a lot of it we kind of skipped around because a lot of that was commandments and sort of legislative material, but sort of inserted in between were sort of narrative episodes that pertain to the life of Moses, and so we hit those. Numbers, the same thing. Numbers had a bunch of different things in it, like 2 censuses, censi, wherever we want to go with that. And some more legislative material, but there were also some narrative parts, some story parts having to do with the life of Moses, so we highlighted those. But now as we come to Deuteronomy, the book of Deuteronomy, pretty much the whole thing, there's a tiny little bit of narrative at the beginning and a tiny little bit of narrative at the end, but is almost entirely a sermon or a homily, a public discourse by Moses to the Israelite people. And so that makes it fundamentally, I mean, certainly Moses has said things at different points along the way, but we haven't seen any kind of extended sort of sermon material like this from Moses in the past. Usually when Moses has spoken in the past, he's either been speaking with God, or if he's been speaking with the people, he's been giving them directives, instructions, directions, go do this, here's how to do it, here's what to do, here's what to not do, right? But now, he's going to be speaking. The reason Deuteronomy is called Deuteronomy, it comes from the Greek, Deuteros Nomos, which means second Torah or second law, because what he's going to talk about, what Moses is going to talk about here, is not all new material. He's going to be talking about and summarizing and applying and commenting on his life up to this point, the life of the people of Israel up to this point, and then sending them off because he's been told by God at the end of the book of Numbers that he's about to die, sending them off to go into the land where he's not going to be physically with them, right? And so to prepare them for that. And so this long extended sort of sermon is aimed at sort of all of those things. And so the parts that we read in this Bible study, in terms of Moses' life, are going to be the parts where he's commenting on significant events of his life, significant events and how he related to the people, places where we see something of his relationship with God and his relationship with the people as a leader, where he's reflecting on things, where he's applying things maybe in a little different way than we've seen before, where he's adding some emphasis, some interpretation that shows us something about Moses. Those are going to be the passages that we're going to be highlighting as we go through here. We're sort of in the end game of the life of Moses part of this Bible study. It'll continue. I'm probably going to do life of Joshua next because it'll just flow nicely to then go into the book of Joshua. But we're in the end game of that. And so we've got a man here who, as we begin, he's 120 years old. Remember, Moses spends the first 40 years of his life in Egypt. Then he flees after murdering the Egyptian. He goes out into the desert, meets his wife, his father-in-law, and is married to his wife, having children, and working for his father-in-law as a herdsman for another 40 years. So by the time God appears to Moses in the burning bush and sends him to go free the people from Egypt, he is 80 years old. That's when all the stuff we're familiar with about Moses pretty much, right? This whole story we've been following for most of this Bible study on Moses is all starting when he was 80 until he's 120. Right? So if any of you feel like, you're getting older and you haven't accomplished much in life, think of Moses, right? 80 isn't too late to get started, right? But so he's now a man of 120 years. So he has been through a lot. He has seen a lot. He's sort of lived 3 different lives, right? He had sort of a young adult life as a prince in Egypt, and then he had an adult life as a husband and a father and a herdsman, and now he's had this third life as a prophet, the prophet, and the leader of right, the Israelite people and everything that has entailed. And so he's reflecting, right? All of that experience, all of the wisdom he's gained, everything he's gained from and developed in terms of his relationship with God, who's spoken to God regularly face to face, right? All of that is reflected now in these sort of final words of his to the people. So that's sort of some setup about who Moses is as we start out here in Deuteronomy. We also have to remember who the people are. The people he's talking to about all these things are not the original people he brought out of Egypt. That's why 40 years has passed since the Exodus. And it's sometimes, even the way we've done this Bible study, we can kind of lose sight of it because everything from crossing the Red Sea to about 5 or 6 chapters into the book of Numbers takes place in like 2 years. And then the rest of the book of Numbers to where we start today is 40 years. So it's not sort of an even amount of time. Because early on in the book of Numbers, as we saw, they're referred to as spies in most English translations. We talked about it. They're more like surveyors. But they were sent into the land of Canaan to search it out, to prepare for the people to go in, just a few years after they had left Egypt. But all of those spies except for 2, Joshua and Caleb, proved faithless in the sense that they did not trust God to lead the people in and fulfill his promises. They said we shouldn't even try because they'll defeat us. And so because of that, God's judgment was, okay, you're not going to get to enter the promised land. You're going to die in the desert. That's a very harsh way to say that, right? And it seems that makes God very harsh. Like, okay, they were a little bit scared of the Canaanites, right? They were scared of the giants. That's normal. Why is God, killing them for it? But God isn't killing them for it, right? They don't get killed. God doesn't smite them all, right? For that 40 years, God is feeding them with manna every day. He's supplying them with water every day. He's making it so that their clothing doesn't wear out, even, right? So God is taking care of them. They have this life in the camp. They have this life in the community of Israel, worshiping God. They have all that. And most importantly for them, from their perspective, they know that their children are going to get to go into the land and receive the promises of God, right? Even though they've sort of removed themselves from having that privilege, their children are going to get to live in the land, and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren, right? So all of that is still promised. So that 40 years has now passed. That generation that came out of Egypt has died, including Moses' sister Miriam has already died. Aaron the high priest has already died and been replaced by his son, Eleazar, right? So that generation is gone. This new generation has grown up and become adults in that 40 years, right? They're now the ones getting ready to go into the land. And so, as Moses speaks to them, this is why we need to have this stuff repeated that we already read in the other books, right? Because a lot of the people he's speaking to weren't there when some of those things happened, to learn those lessons firsthand. They weren't there when certain instructions were given. They weren't there when certain commandments were given. Okay, that's one piece. The second piece is they're now getting ready to go into the land. They're going to be now putting down roots and living in one place. Their life so far, at least since they were little kids, has been lived in a camp of tents out in the desert, moving place to place to place to place. They're going to be living in a very different way than their parents did after coming out of Egypt. And so some of the instructions and applications that Moses is going to give are aimed at that, right? So there's a way they're celebrating the Passover, living in tents in a mobile nomad camp out in the wilderness. There are going to be certain differences in how they celebrate it once they move into the land, right? And they're spread out, and they're dwelling in permanent dwellings and all of this. That's going to cause there to be differences. The Day of Atonement is going to be a little different, right? There are going to be all these little differences. That, by the way, I know what I just said seems obvious, right? But you would be surprised how many documentaries you can go watch right now on just about any streaming service where you will see someone with a PhD say, well, look, there's all these contradictions between what Deuteronomy says about how to celebrate Passover and what Exodus says. And when you look at what they say the contradictions are, you're like, well, yeah, duh, they're living in houses now. Right? So I know sometimes I say things, and sometimes I try to remember to point out why I'm saying it. But sometimes I may be saying things that sound totally rudimentary and obvious to you. That's usually because there's some really smart guy out there who's saying really stupid things about it. So all of that goes into, why is Moses doing this? Why is Moses rehearsing all of this? Why is he reiterating all of this? And woven through that, and these are the parts, like I said, that we're going to be reading, is a lot of Moses himself, his own heart for the people, his own heart for God, the things he has learned, right? And those are the things we're going to be focusing on in this Bible study. So all of that said by way of intro, unless anybody has any leftover comments or questions, or having any further technical difficulties that need to be ironed out. We will go ahead and get started in Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 1. It doesn't get easier to find than that. So, okay. Now these are the words Moses spoke to all Israel beyond the Jordan, in the desert, in the plain opposite Suf, between Paran, Tophel, Laban, Hazarot, and Dizahab. We all know where those 4 places are. But so this is an area that's known as the Plains of Moab. And this is really where we left off at the end of Numbers. So they are right on the other side of the Jordan River from Canaan. And they're preparing. When they cross the Jordan, they will be, although it's not proverbial yet at this time in history, they'll be proverbially crossing the Rubicon, right? That's going to be the beginning of war. And the Canaanite kings are going to take it that way, right? They're no longer, oh, there's some nomads out in the desert on the other side of the river. It's going to be, there's this big group of people who have now invaded our region, right? So they are at the place where they're going to make that fording of the Jordan River. Verse 2, it is 11 days' journey from Horeb by way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea. What does that have to do with anything? Well, this is an interesting thing because Mount Horeb, right? What this means is if they had gone directly from where they were back when the spies or the surveyors, right, said if they had gone directly from there to where they are now in a straight shot through Edomite territory, that's where Mount Seir is, which they couldn't, but they had spent the 40 years wandering, it would have taken them 11 days. Right, so the idea is the wandering was not required, right? None of that was required to have happened. This amount of time to have passed was not required. It could have been less than 2 weeks, right? If not for the faithlessness of the people. But you also get, so there's 2 elements there. Number 1, you see the punishment, but you also see the grace and the mercy of God in that, well, they did finally get there, though. Right? They did finally get to where they were going. Right? But there was discipline required. Now it came to pass in the 40th year, in the 11th month, on the first day of the month, Moses spoke to the sons of Israel according to all the Lord gave him as commandments to them. So this is the 40th year, the 11th month, and all that since all that happened, right? So you're contrasting the 11th day with 40 years, 11 months, and 2 days, right? And now Moses is going to speak. So after he killed Sihon, king of the Amorites, who dwelt in Heshbon, and Og, king of Bashan, who dwells at Ashtaroth in Edrei. Okay, so we talked about them in Numbers. They keep coming up. And back in Numbers, Og and Sihon got killed. It's mentioned again here, but Moses is going to bring it up again in not too long. So we'll come back to them and talk a little more about them when Moses talks a little bit more about them. But remember, these 2 kings become sort of emblematic and important in all of Israel's history. And even today, go to Matins on Christmas Day. It is not Christmas until you hear about Og and Sihon getting killed. It's in the Polyelios. Lots of other feasts too, but I don't know, it just seems Christmassy to me. Okay. So verse 5, beyond the Jordan in the land of Moses, in the land of Moab, Moses began to explain this law, saying. Now remember, law is really here translated the word Torah. Torah means more like teaching. It's a much broader concept than just law, the way we think of law. Like, that's not against the law, right? Well, maybe not the narrow conception of like the legal system, but right? So this is more than that. And that's why it says this law. This Torah means this teaching. He's expressing, saying, you've dwelt long enough at this mountain. Turn and take your journey and go to the mountain of the Amorites, to all the neighboring places in the Arabah, in the mountains and in the plain, to the south and on the seacoast, to the land of the Canaanites and to Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates. Behold, I am delivering the land in your presence. Go in and inherit the land I swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give it to them and their seed after them. Okay? So he starts out by saying, here's what we're about to do, right? God sent us here. Those promises that go all the way back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the reason why we left Egypt in the first place, all of this now is about to come to its fulfillment. Verse 9, so I spoke to you at that time, saying, I alone am not able to bear you. It's a great way of phrasing that. We saw this, when we saw this story originally, it was in the third person, right, where Moses is trying to deal with all the disputes of the people and sort of deal with everything, all the way down to little disputes and matters. And his father-in-law Jethro says, look, this is too much, right? You need to appoint some people to handle the small stuff. They can refer the big stuff to you, right? But you need some help. Here, when Moses is talking about it, he just says, look, I couldn't deal with you people by myself, right? Like, it was just too much. You were just too much. The Lord your God multiplied you, and here you are today as the stars of heaven in multitude. May the Lord God of your fathers make you 1,000 times more numerous than you are and bless you just as he said. How can I alone bear your labors, your burdens, and your lawsuits? Choose wise, understanding, and knowledgeable men from among your tribes, and I will make them leaders over you. And you answered me and said, the thing you told us to do is good. These are details we didn't get before either, right? So this is supposed to say, hey, you agreed to this, right? You bought it. This wasn't something I imposed on you, right? It wasn't even something God imposed on you, right? You accepted that there needed to be people in leadership positions. Why would he want to remind them of that? Well, once you have people in those leadership positions, they might not be as happy about obeying them as they were at first when they were first being appointed, right? So it's like, oh yeah, this is a good person. I like him. He'd be a good leader. Yeah, he should be our leader. And then he says something you don't like, right? Tries to lead you in a direction you don't want to go, right? Yes, sir.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
You can hear me? Oh, okay. Hello, live stream. My name is Rob. Okay. The question I have is this. You have the book of Judges, and they weren't judges like we think of judges today, right?
Right.
So, but I see here, I'm reading from a different translation. I'll just read you how it renders it here, and you can tell me whether or not it has the same meaning as the Judges in the book of Joshua, right? Or is it?
Or the book of Judges?
Yeah, the book of Judges. I don't know. I'm a little bit off. Okay, so this is in verse 15. So I took the wise and respected men you had and you had selected from your tribes and appointed them to serve as judges and officials over you. Is this the same as the judges that were later appointed, or is this a different type of office? Thank you.
Yeah. So just like law here, the word that's being translated law means more than just law, the way we think about it. The same thing's true with the word judge, right? So when we think of judges, right, we think the guy in the robe, but we think of somebody who's hearing court cases, right? Now, these people did do that. That was one of the responsibility of leaders is there's a dispute between two people in the group that they're leading, right? They need to resolve that dispute, right? And even when that was done in ancient Israel, that was far less formal than our modern legal system, right? Like there weren't lawyers per se, or right? You definitely didn't have anything like a jury. You didn't, right? It was the person who's the leader is going to settle this, and so he would sort of hear out both sides, and both sides could bring witnesses or whatever to him to hear, and then he made a decision when a dispute had to be settled. But on a bigger scale, to understand what judges are from a biblical perspective, you have to understand what justice is from a biblical perspective. So justice in the ancient Near East, and so this includes the Bible, justice is a state of being, right, in the world, in the cosmos, where everything and everyone is in their correct, proper place. They're all doing what they're supposed to be doing, and everything is functioning together in harmony, right? That's justice. So if we have that, justice has been established, right? If that gets broken, someone's not doing what they're supposed to be doing, right? Someone is in the wrong place, or something is in the wrong place, right? This order is broken, things stop functioning harmoniously. That's injustice. Okay? So then, when someone comes into that situation where there's injustice, where things are out of order, right? When they come in and they restore that order, they put things back the way they're supposed to be, whether that's dealing with people or things, right? They put things back in the place they're supposed to be and get things functioning correctly. They are judging. That is the verb to judge, right? Means to put the things back in order. Okay? And so the person who is assigned to do that, right? Because you have to have a person assigned to do that, right? The person who's assigned to do that is then called a judge. Okay? So, for example, the judges in the book of Judges, right, don't hear any court cases, right? But what do? Something has gone wrong in Israel. The pattern in the book of Judges is Israel sins, so there's injustice, right? Some foreign enemy invades as a result, right? They become oppressed. They call out to God, and so God sends a judge to put things back in order, to expel the foreign invaders, right? Or kill them all, right? Depending on the judge, right? To get rid of the foreign invaders one way or another, right? To reestablish order among the people, right? To put things back into this just order. So that's why they're called judges, right? And so the jobs of these people is the same thing. It's just on a day-to-day basis, it was a little different, right? So they're the head of a clan or a tribe in Israel. That means they're responsible for making sure that all the people in their clan or in their tribe and in the lands that they hold, that everybody is in the right place, everybody is doing the right thing, everything is functioning harmoniously, right? And if each of those units, if each clan is doing that, and each tribe is doing that, then the whole of Israel will be doing that, right? That's the idea. So that's what he's talking about.
A quick follow-up. So
Yeah.
basically, they're like governors over
Yeah.
tribes.
Yeah, governing would be a synonym. Yeah. Yeah,
Okay, and you alluded earlier to chaos and order. So I'm reminded of the first book of Genesis at that point, where, the Spirit of God, the Holy Spirit, and the Logos brought order out of chaos. So is that sort of the judge here? Are they sort of like embodying, or for lack of a better expression, incarnate that sort of spirit
Yes,
to bring?
that's because man is made in
Okay.
the image of God,
Yeah.
right? And so that's why, so in
I'm
Genesis,
done with my question. Thank you.
in Genesis 1, right, God establishes that order for the first time in creation, right? He puts everything in order. He looks at it. He says everything is good, right? Because everything is in the right place. Everything is functioning correctly. So we all know that gets broken. But both before and after it gets broken, when God talks to Adam, right? God speaks to humanity and says, here's what I created you to do. He says, fill the earth and subdue it, right? So filling the earth is filling it with life, right? Make babies, right? But the subdue it part is you continue to put it in order, right? In good functioning order, right? And so the original task that God gives Adam in Eden, the plan is, well, not the plan because God knew it was going to happen, but the instructions are that don't get followed, was that Eden, remember, is not the whole world. We're told in Genesis, Eden is this garden that God plants in a particular place. And then God actually makes Adam outside of Eden, it says, and then puts him in Eden, puts him in the garden, puts him in paradise, right? And tells him to fill the earth and subdue it. So the idea there is a garden represents sort of the perfect balance, the perfect inner working of something that is in order, well ordered, because it's a garden, right? It's not like a swamp back in southern Louisiana, right? You got plenty of life in a swamp, but not a lot of order, right? Right? Or on the other side, you could have order without life, right? You could pave over everything, right? Everything's just bare concrete, right? It can be very orderly, all geometric shapes, right? But there's no life going on there, right? But a garden is both very well ordered, cared for, weeded, right? Taken care, but also because you have put it in good order. Not in spite of, but because of that good order, it generates life. And life that is then life-giving to people who come and eat from the garden, right? So it's that perfect melding. And so Adam and Eve's created task was to leave paradise, but to take paradise with them and transform the whole creation into paradise by filling the earth with life and subduing it and putting it in order. But because of sin, Adam and Eve leave paradise, but they don't take paradise with them. Right. This is why the concepts in the Bible of God returning and judging the world and the idea of a new creation are the same idea. Because God judging the earth means he comes back and he puts it back in perfect order, this time permanently. The whole creation in perfect order permanently, right? And that constitutes a new creation, right? That's why those are the same thing. That's also why St. Paul can talk about a person being justified, a person being put back in order, right? Being put back in order, and talk about them being a new creation, being created again, right? The old man and the new man, right? When you put the old man back into order, he becomes a new man. He is, right, created again. Yes, sir.
Is that what Jesus is talking about when he says, judge not, lest you be judged? Or
Yes.
okay.
Yes. So the things about not judging, right, that we read in the New Testament and the Fathers are not, as they're commonly interpreted today, never point out what is sin. That's how people want to read that today, right? If someone's committing some sin, no matter how horrible, no matter how egregious, you're not allowed to say, hey, that's wrong, you shouldn't do that.
Sorry.
Right? That's not right what that's about.
Lo siento.
Judging is about, it's not your job, right, to go out and put the whole world back in order. Right? Because St. Paul is going to say to you, if you judge yourself, you will not be judged. If you're worried about the judgment of God on the last day, start getting your life in order now. Start repenting now. Right? Because if you get to work on that now, right, it's better than leaving that for then. Right? That's what it's talking about. And so, yeah, Christ is saying it's not your job to go around trying to not only the world, but even other people. Right? Unless you're my spiritual son, in which case, by virtue of the fact that God made me a priest, it is my job for my spiritual children to help them, put themselves in order, right? But if you're not, even me as a priest, right? It's not my job to just everyone I run into to try and straighten them out, right? Remember the log in your own eye and the speck in the other person's eye, right? Like that's not my job, right? And so, yeah, that's an important word to all of us, right? Because there's a lot of folks out there. Let me put this in really for Orthodox terms. And I know a couple of you who introduced yourselves to me are catechumen. Some of you may have recently come into the church, right? It's not your job to save the world. It's not your job to save the church. It's not your job to judge the church, to judge bishops, to govern the church, to govern bishops, right? Each of us has a really big job to do. That's to judge ourselves, right? To try and work out our own salvation with fear and trembling. Trying to save everyone and everything, or even anyone else, is
Correct me if I'm
beyond our
wrong,
calling.
but
Yes, sir.
just a quick follow-up on what was asked a few moments ago. This is a quick question. In the New Testament verse, because I don't have a Greek New Testament in front of me, but krisis, right, is the Greek word for judgment, and that transliterates into
Yeah.
and that transliterates into English as crisis. So maybe,
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that the
Yeah.
Greek word for crisis, judgment, means crisis in English. So when you judge someone, you kind of put yourself in a state of crisis, right? That's what I wanted to say. There you go.
Yes, sir.
Hey, just real quick. My name's Dan.
You're going to have to project a little.
My name's Daniel.
Yeah.
So just circling back to what you said at the very not the very beginning, but
Earlier. Yeah.
You said having a proper understanding of justice, like the ancient way that they viewed that, is key to understanding like this and judges. And how on earth, besides having you tell it to us, does one, how are we able, I mean, obviously, like, I've read this a lot of times, and I would still come away with the modern conception of justice, judges. So I'm saying, how can someone reading on their own, or, I mean, is it even possible, like, to learn what ancient people thought of?
Right.
So, yeah.
Well, so a couple things about that. I mean, on one level, you can't, right? That's what the Ethiopian eunuch says to St. Philip, right, in Acts. He said they're reading the Isaiah scroll, and St. Philip says, do you understand what you're reading? And he's like, how can I unless someone explains it to me, right? And it's for the same basic reason, right? He's an Ethiopian eunuch in the 1st century AD. He's reading Isaiah writing in the 8th century BC in the kingdom of Israel, right? Like, you know, who are these people groups he's even talking about, right? Like, so there's a level of that, right? That said, we live in an amazing time. And part of the judgment against all of us, me included, when that day comes, is going to be how little we took advantage of all of the things that we have that no previous generation of Christians has had. Right? Like, I carry around in my pocket every day, right? This, which I could use to access the sum total of human knowledge from all of history, right? And mostly I send funny pictures of cats and like Star Trek memes, right? So we have access to, right? I could go to Bible Gateway right now and pull up like 37 different translations of the Bible and the original text in Hebrew, in Greek, right? Multiple languages, Aramaic, right? Like, I have access to all that and all kinds of notes on it, right? I have access to like a library of the Church Fathers' writings, translated and in the original language. I have access to all of this, and you don't have to go back that far. Okay, when in 1904, the Patriarchate of Constantinople published the first Orthodox, quasi-official Greek New Testament, printed, because the Turks wouldn't let them operate a printing press, right? 1904. And to compile it, they went and got the gospel books from 250 churches, which were hand copied because they couldn't operate a printing press. And took all of those and used those to compile and do the first printed text. Right? So 150 years ago in Greece, people didn't have Bibles. The church they went to had the gospel book and the epistle book, right, and the scriptures. And they could hear them read, and they could hear the, right? You go back much further than that, nobody's literate. So even if you handed them a Bible, right, they couldn't have even read it, right? Just read it, let alone interpret it, what it says. So we have access to all of this now. And so you can learn about the view of justice in the scriptures by reading the church fathers, right? Reading, right, books written, right, about the ancient world and about the scriptures, and commentaries written by church fathers and all of these things. So at one level, yes, the Ethiopian eunuch was right. We do need the church to instruct us on how to properly interpret the scriptures. But on another level, we now have access to the teachings of the church, right? Even on my own, right? I can access the teaching of the church in a way far beyond what any previous generation could. And even my dad's generation, right, was pre-internet, so didn't have access to all that. Right? If he wanted old journal articles, he had to go to a library. Does anybody here even know what a microfiche was? That's all the old guys like me raising their hand. Yeah, that's right. You had to go and like by hand sort through all of these like black and white, essentially weird photos of old articles to try to find the one you wanted, and look through giant catalogs to find out which ones to even look at. You know, as opposed to I just ask Google. I don't even have to type if I don't want to. Yeah. So that's, but so the reason why I do these kind of Bible studies is essentially, on YouTube, there's another place where people can go to find out more about this stuff. So, okay. So yeah, Moses points out, hey, you agreed to this. You agreed to having these leaders. You agreed to them being the ones who would make these decisions. Verse 15, so I took from you wise, understanding, and knowledgeable men, and made them leaders over you, leaders of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, and of tens, judges to interpret the law for you, right? To interpret the Torah for you, right? Because this is kind of a sorry Protestants, right? But we were just talking about the Ethiopian eunuch, right? Just the written text does not answer every possible question you could have, right? Every little detailed question you could possibly have is not answered by the written text of the scriptures, right? So you need someone who is authorized by God to take what is written and apply it to all these different situations that come up in real life, right? And so that's what they're doing. They're right, applying it. And additionally, we have to understand that the Torah is connected to what we were just saying about justice, right? Why does the Torah end up getting called the law in the first place, right? Because the understanding was that the Torah is laying out for us a description of what that perfect order would look like, right? Now, it's a late Bronze Age picture of what that would look like. Before someone asked me a question about slavery, etc., right? It's a late Bronze Age picture of what that would look like. It's not a timeless picture of what that would look like. I just got a lot of Jewish people mad at me by saying that, but it's not a timeless view of what that would look like. But it's a view of what that would look like in the Bronze Age. Right? Just like in the New Testament, when St. Paul is giving some of these details, he's giving us a view, right? And that's why, from the perspective of the New Testament writers, they're not abolishing the Torah, even when it looks like they're changing details, right? In their mind, they're not abolishing it, right? They're applying it. Now we're in a new situation. Not least of all because the Messiah has come now, right? But we're in a new situation. And so we need to reapply and reinterpret it in light of the coming of the Messiah, in light of what has changed. And so in the New Testament, we get a first century picture of what that looks like. But for example, in the 4th century, something that St. Paul literally dreamed about, because he says so, happens, and the Roman emperor becomes a Christian. Well, now the Roman emperor is a Christian, right? The empire that rules most of the known world is headed by a Christian. How does that work? How do we do that? How does he act and behave? What should he make illegal? In terms of if he makes all sin illegal, we're all in trouble. Right? So what sin needs to be illegal and what sin maybe do we deal with another way? Right? What happens if someone tries to invade? How does a Christian lead an army? Right? This whole set of questions comes up, right? And the fathers who are living at the time don't say, well, we're in whole new territory here, let's come up with something. Let's get our heads together, right? But they also don't say like, well, this verse says that if the Roman emperor is a Christian, right? Because there's not a verse that says that. But they go to the scriptures, right? And they say, well, how does the Roman emperor behave? Well, what made a king a good and a just king in the Old Testament when there were Israelite kings? Let's start there and work from there. Because an emperor is not exactly the same thing as a king. But it's a good starting point, right? And what do we need to make illegal out of sin, and what do we need to deal with in another way? Well, there were different penalties for different kinds of sin, right, in the Torah. So maybe we start there. It's not going to look exactly the same, right? Because we've got, we're dealing with some different things. But that's a good starting point, right? Like the ones that had the death penalty are ones we need to deal with maybe in one way, and the ones where you just had to like pay back what you stole, well, okay, that's a different way of dealing with it, right? So this is, right? So it's a much more complex kind of situation with a lot more give and take in terms of applying the scriptures and in terms of, but they all believed all the way through, right? Whether we're talking about the people writing the Old Testament books after the Torah, whether we're talking about the New Testament writers, whether we're talking about the church fathers, they never thought, well, the Torah, the New Testament, the last stage, the old thing, we're getting rid of that and doing this new thing. From their perspective, no, we're taking this idea of the justice of God, right, of the order that God created his creation in and intends for his creation, and we're going to apply that in our world today the way it looks, right? And this is something, frankly, that Orthodox folks need to get more deliberate about today, right? Because we haven't thought about this seriously. Right? Here's what I mean. All of you here have been online. I know, you can't lie to me and hide it. Right? So you're going to find one type of Orthodox folk online who are like, we need an emperor. We need a czar of all the Americas, right? Like, because the only way we can imagine, right? And what is that? That's saying, okay, well, there was this way from, say, Constantine through Nicholas II, right? There was this way that we did it, right? And that's the only way we can imagine doing it, right? We just cookie cutter that and try to impose that on America. Good luck. I mean, it'd be cool, but good luck, right? I don't think you're going to pull it off any time in my lifetime, right? Okay, so, right? And then you get a lot of folks who just think like, okay, well, the way an Orthodox Christian interacts with American society is pretty much just the same way that a conservative Roman Catholic or a conservative Protestant does. That dog don't hunt for me. We got a lot of significant differences. I'm not trying to deliberately throw shade here, though some of you will think I am, despite my protestations, okay? But Reformed Baptists, Roman Catholic cardinals, and Orthodox priests have fundamentally different views of marriage. We do not have the same view of marriage. Protestants do not think it's a sacrament. That's pretty big. Okay? And if you look at how Roman Catholics refuse to deal with divorce, there's a pretty big difference between them and us on subjects of marriage. So the idea that all three of us should address all of the issues about marriage in American culture in the same way doesn't make a lot of sense. Right? Doesn't make a lot of sense. Maybe we'd get surprised, right? Maybe if we Orthodox folks did the work, right? How do we apply our Orthodox theology of marriage to these political and social situations? Maybe we'd be surprised to find out, well, it turns out it is the same way that a Reformed Baptist would. I mean, maybe that's what we do, but we haven't done that work. We're shortcutting that work. And just saying like, well, we're all Christians of a sort, so we probably all, right? The Protestants have done the work in America, because America's been a Protestant country for a long time, right? So their views on these things reflect their Protestant theology on a very deep and direct level. And that's why I say it seems to me that if ours really reflect our Orthodox theology, there's probably going to be some differences, right? But that's just one set of issues. There's all kinds of things, right? Like, what does the Orthodox Church have to say about voting? If you vote for and support a candidate, are you responsible for what they do? Or not? Right? Should an Orthodox Christian just vote for the lesser of two evils if you're convinced both candidates are evil and you're in the American system where there can only ever be two? We haven't, as Orthodox Christians, we haven't done that work. Because in most Orthodox countries, there hasn't been any voting. Right? You didn't get to vote on who's going to be the czar next, right? Like, that's not how that works. So we need to think this through, right? Out of the Orthodox ethical tradition, right? We need to start that work of thinking through, right? What does it mean for an Orthodox Christian now here has the power, the responsibility, maybe responsibility. Do you have to vote? Do you have a responsibility to vote? As an Orthodox, right? We're hard pressed to even say that, right? Might turn out maybe we shouldn't vote, right? I mean, maybe that's why they don't have voting in most Orthodox countries, right? So we need to do all that work of figuring out how do we take our understanding as Orthodox Christians of the law of God, right? Of the justice of God, our Orthodox understanding of it, and how do we apply that? How do we embody that on a corporate, right, like political level in 21st century democracies like the United States? So if any of you were thinking about doing PhD work, in like political science or Orthodox theology, there's a huge unexplored realm for you to go straight into. Lots of dissertations and journal articles. You'll have tenure in no time.
Well, real quick, would that be something that the bishops do? Like, they lay out these things for us, or?
Well, yeah, so the bishop's job, not every bishop is made a bishop to be a theologian. Not every bishop is a theologian, and not every theologian is a bishop. Right? So the job of the bishop is like we were reading about here with the leaders who Moses appointed. Their job is to take the Orthodox tradition and apply it to the issues within the region that they have authority over. Right? That's their job. And so some of them are and this is small t theologian. I'm not talking about like St. John, St. Simeon, right? Small t theologian. Some of them are also theologians and sort of do that work, right, of fleshing all of that out. And some of them, that's not their, and if that is something they do, usually they have some kind of specialization. Anybody who comes to you and says they do theology, or they have a PhD in theology, or they teach theology, and they don't specify anything, like historical theology, patristic theology, biblical, right? It's just theology in general, be very suspicious. Right? Because to really be good at something, you have to specialize. To be really good at something, you have to really specialize. Right? So any complete non-specialist probably is not all that skilled, right? But my point there being, even bishops who are sort of theologians usually have some area of that where they excel and where they make this contribution that then the other bishops can access. But the church also has other people who participate in that work, right? So there are monastics, right, who are doing theology and some of these things. There are priests. There are unordained people. I mean, St. Maximus the Confessor, not ordained, right? So who make those contributions? Now, again, with the bishop, they're all making contributions to be used by the bishops, right? So it's the bishop. If I can do all the Bible studies I want and publish all the books I want and all of this, right? But none of that like requires the Orthodox bishops or any bishop in particular to reference my stuff or not contradict my stuff or pay attention to my stuff, right? I put it out there as a resource for people. I'd be super flattered and honored if a bishop ever, right, like quoted something I said and said, you know, I think this is right and this is the right way to interpret and apply this, right? But it's just it's a resource out there. And so that's how I think that kind of theologian and specialist works. You're putting things out there, you're doing the work, you can publish the journal articles, you can write the dissertation and stuff. And then the church as a whole, guided by the Holy Spirit, does this weeding out, right? And it's usually not conscious in the sense that there's not some guy like issuing all the edicts, even a bishop, right? It's usually something that happens over the centuries, right? Some people are seen as church fathers and some aren't. Some writings of the church fathers are copied and preserved and some aren't. We don't have every word St. John Chrysostom ever said, right? We don't have everything St. Paul ever wrote in the Bible, right? And we believe that the Holy Spirit is guiding that process to make sure that each generation gets the things we need. So again, I will be super flattered if 100 years from now, anything I did still exists, right? Like within the Orthodox Church. I don't know for sure that's going to happen, but I will be mega honored, assuming, you know, everything works out with me being dead and everything, such that I'm able to feel honored. If that's the case, right? But this is what St. Paul's talking about when he says, we have this foundation right, that's laid by the apostles and prophets with Christ as the chief cornerstone, and then each of us builds on it according to the abilities God has given us. And then once we're done building, God puts it to the fire, right? The day of judgment comes, the wood, the hay, the stubble, the junk burns off, whatever is gold, silver, right? Gems, precious metal, that stays. Right? So I'm just hoping maybe there's some diamond in the rough in all this content I put out. Right? But yeah, so that's what I'm saying. But still, some of you guys might want to do graduate work, and you're like, what hasn't been written about? This stuff about the political and social stuff and how specifically Orthodox theology specifically interacts with it is wide open, needs the work. Look at Twitter. These people need your help. They don't know their right hand from their left. They don't know what they're doing. Okay. So verse 16, then I commanded your judges at that time, saying, hear the cases between your brethren, and judge righteously between a man and his brother or the resident alien with him. Okay. So this is talking about specifically hearing cases dealing with disputes, right? He says you need to hear them, right? And hear the cases doesn't just mean don't dismiss them. Hear the cases means you need to listen, right? Listen to the people. Hear them out about these disputes. Resolve these disputes, right? And you need to do that, right? Not just with your brethren, right? But you judge righteously between a man and his brother or the resident alien. And then he's going to say, you shall not show partiality in judgment. You shall judge the small and the great. You shall not shrink before any man's presence, for the judgment is God's. The case too hard for you, bring to me, and I will hear it. So I commanded you at the time all the words you should do, right? So the judgment is God's. You're doing God's work, literally, when you do this, when you resolve these disputes, right? This is God setting things right through you. And that means you need to be like God when you do it. And God doesn't care if somebody's rich or poor, right? He doesn't care if someone's intimidating or not, right? That's shrinking from any man's presence. He doesn't care if he's a quote-unquote citizen of Israel or if he's a foreigner, right? God doesn't take any of that into account, right? And therefore you shouldn't either. You need to exercise God's judgment. Verse 19, so we departed from Horeb and went through all the great and fearful desert you saw on the way to the mountains of the Amorite, as the Lord of God commanded us. Then we came to Kadesh Barnea. Then I said to you, you have come to the mountains of the Amorite, which the Lord our God is giving us. Behold, the Lord your God is delivering the land to you in your presence. Go up and take it as an inheritance, in the manner the Lord God of your fathers spoke to you. Do not fear or be afraid. Okay. So we keep hearing about the mountain of the Amorites, right? So the Amorites, with Sihon, king of the Amorites, we already saw him. We're going to see more of him, as I said. The Amorites, I've talked about this in the Bible study before, I know, but hey, everything is somebody's first. Amorite is the Hebraization of the Babylonian word Amuru, which means Westerner, person from the West. So the Amorites were a group of people from what's now Syria, particularly centered around Mount Horeb. Not Mount Horeb, sorry, Mount Hermon. We've been talking about Mount Horeb and it got stuck in my brain. Mount Hermon. Mount Hermon. Hermon comes from the same root in Hebrew as the Arabic word haram. Okay, it's haram in Hebrew. And it means forbidden, right? Cursed, right? Like bad, okay? So it's the bad mountain, the evil mountain, right? And the reason for that is, still to this day, I don't recommend you go there literally this day because it's in the Golan Heights. Not a good time to be in the Golan Heights. But it's to this day covered with the remains of pagan shrines all over it. And one of the big pagan shrines was originally to Baal, later became a shrine to Pan. the Greek god Pan, and was considered to be a gateway to the underworld. So there's like an entrance to hell at the bottom of Mount Hermon, right? So bad place, right? Bad place. That's where they are on the plains of Moab, by the way. They're near there, right? So Sihon was king of the Amorites. That's where the Amorites came from. The Amorites in the middle, a few hundred years before this, the Amorites conquered the Babylonian Empire and set themselves up. That's why there's a Babylonian word for them. They're the ones who came from the west, from Syria and into Mesopotamia, right? And conquered the Babylonian Empire. The most famous one of them, the most famous Amorite, is Hammurabi. He was an Amorite. And tied up in this is the fact that the Amorites claimed they had the secret wisdom that was given by the gods before the flood. Right? They claimed they still had that. And that's what their pagan rituals, magic, sorcery, technology, all of that stuff came from that, right? So these are the bad dudes, right? These are the sort of the human emissaries of hell. So the reason we're bringing up the mountain of the Amorites is these giant clans, right? These folks, right, are, because we're about to hear about the spies, these are the folks they were afraid of, right? Yes, sir. Yes.
This has to do with the Book of Enoch narrative with
Yes.
the Watchers coming down and
Right.
on
yeah.
Mount Hermon.
So Genesis chapter 6 verses 1 through 4 and a bunch of other passages, but get interpreted in Jewish literature like the Book of Enoch, right, is giving us some added context. And we have these stories now from the Babylonian side, right? So the Jewish side of it is this is all evil, right? So all these Greek, well, they weren't Greek yet, but all of these heroes like Gilgamesh is specifically listed as a giant in the Book of the Giants, right? Who are part god and part human, you know, where some human and some god or goddess mated and produced this heroic offspring, these ancient kings, these ancient god kings. They were all evil tyrants, right? Genesis tells us, right? It flips that narrative, right? The time before the flood was not this golden age of knowledge and wisdom and all of this that came from the gods, right? It was this horribly evil time of corruption and destruction. That quote unquote wisdom revealed by the gods was, you know, sorcery, the dark arts, right? And evil and corruption. Technology was men learning how to kill each other more efficiently. Like, this was all terrible. So the Genesis perspective is just taking the pagan perspective and flipping it, right? So at the time here, we're at the tail end of the Amorites, right? Sihon is sort of the last king of the Amorites. We're told that Og is the last of the Rephaim, which were a similar group that we read about in Ugarit of ancient kings, ancient god kings. So the idea is that the representatives of those people now, those people before the flood, those horribly wicked people before the flood, their sons, right? Their representatives on earth, according to their own propaganda, are the Amorites. Right? So they're sort of the embodiment of demonic evil in Moses' age. Right? And that's why, like, the spies and stuff get so scared. They say, we saw the Nephilim there, right? They're like, these are those people, right? You right? We need to stay away from those people, right? And God says to the contrary, right? We'll get more of this in chapter 2, which we probably won't get to tonight, but next month we'll do chapter 2. God is explicitly bringing them there to get rid of those people. There's this list that we saw back when we did the life of Abraham in this Bible study. but now we've seen repeatedly in the life of Moses, and we're going to see again when we get into the life of Joshua next. There's a list of specific clans and tribes and people groups in Canaan who are the ones that Israel's to go in there and wipe out. It's not all the Canaanites. It's these specific groups that are practicing these specific things. They have to go. Right? The rest of the Canaanites, like God's even going to tell them, don't go after the Philistines. Philistines are pretty bad, right? They're pagans, right? But they're not this bad. And the main things that these groups are doing, which they say are these ancient rituals and stuff, there are a couple of things, two main ones. One of them is sexual rituals, which are what the whole idea of these things being part God and part human, people being part God and part human comes from, especially associated with the kings. And then the second one is they're doing human sacrifice. And yes, because sacrifices are meals, they're participating in cannibalism. A lot of that is blood drinking people's blood, but some of it goes even further than that in terms of cannibalism. So we'll talk about this more when we get to, especially when we get into Joshua, because a lot of people now are like, oh, that's so terrible. They're going and wiping out these whole tribes of people and their beautiful pagan culture, right? And I say to those people, right, like, if you knew your neighbor was killing and eating people, like knew for a fact, I don't think you'd like try and reason with him to stop or like pray for him and hope that God intervenes, right? You'd call a bunch of men with guns to go into his house and make him stop, right? And while you wouldn't hope it happened, but if the only way they could make him stop was somebody had to shoot him, right? You wouldn't cry a ton of tears over the fact that, right? You'd be like, it's horrible that he had to die, but we couldn't let him keep killing and eating people, right? Like, so I think pretty much at core, everyone kind of agrees with the call God made, right? In terms of this needing to stop, right? Especially when it's being done at an organized collective level. This isn't just one crazy person, right, doing this in secret. This is a whole like tribal culture formed around doing this. Yeah.
As far as the Nephilim, I don't know a whole lot about them, but was there any other god or angel, human creations, and then what happened to them?
Well, so most of them were killed by the flood. That's part of why there was a flood. And then there's some of this afterwards. But don't think about this. You can't think about this in a modern way, because the people writing this are not modern people. They've never heard of DNA, right? So we're not talking about like, it's not like alien human hybrids in the X-Files or something. That's not what we're talking about, right? So we're talking about what we're concretely talking about. We're all adults here, right? Is and we're going to end up talking about this more with Og, because there's this stuff about Og's bed in Deuteronomy. But they had these ritual beds in temples. Okay? And so what we're realistically talking about is a shrine or temple prostitute who is a woman who was a slave who was owned by the priesthood. Okay? Don't buy this nonsense people want to tell you about there being priestesses in these beautiful pagan religions. See, look, they loved women. No, they had sex slaves. Those religions had sex slaves. And those women weren't sex slaves by choice. They weren't into that. So one of them would usually sleep with and be impregnated by the king on particular feasts of the god. And the priest would usually be wearing a ritual mask, like representing the god and embodying the god. So we're talking about pagan sexual rituals that involve demonic possession. And this is why, for example, Gilgamesh, it says he's 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. And you're like, how do you get thirds with two parents? Right? And it's because they didn't think he had two parents. There's human woman king who they believe is a god, demon who they believe is a god possessing him, right? And so you get 3 parents, 2 of them quote unquote divine and 1 human. That's what's going on. A version of this, although they insist since the end of World War II, it's not sexualized anymore. So supposedly, if we trust them, for the last 77 years, it hasn't been sexualized. But a version of this ritual is still done every time there's a new Japanese emperor. The new emperor goes and spends the night with the sun goddess, who is embodied by a essentially slave girl. That's a woman who is not there of her own free will, shall we say. And so since the war, we are told, he no longer actually, the new emperors have not actually had sex with her. But they still do the ritual otherwise. And they admit that before the war, they were. So, Hirohito, yeah, that's where he came from. So, yeah, so this is not just an ancient world thing, and this is not an isolated thing. There are similar rituals. The Khmer in what's now Cambodia and Laos, ancient civilization there, had a version of this. It's all over the world in pagan cultures. Yeah. Yeah. So it's all over the place in paganism. But that's what we're talking about. Like if you had a GoPro, right? Or you did if you did genetic testing on one of these people, like on Gilgamesh, it would just be human DNA, right? Like that's not what they're talking about, right? They're talking about this ritual and spiritual level, right, of reality. Yes, sir.
So you're saying, God sent them into Canaan to wipe out specific people because they were doing very terrible things. It reminds me, on the Lord of Spirits, you talk about demonosis.
Yeah.
And they're going down the path of, far down the path of demonosis.
Yes.
And what is the change between obviously there's a big change, but back then, God's answer is, you're just going to go wipe these people out versus, obviously, as the Orthodox Church, I would say there's still people in the world that are going down the path of demonosis.
Yeah.
But, is kind of, yeah.
Honestly, for most of history until today, most of the people who are that far gone end up getting executed. So kind of the death penalty has still been the answer to that through most of human history, right? This is one of the things you find out when you understand what it means that the Spanish Inquisition killed several werewolves. And everybody's like, oh, that's silly. But werewolf is a way of talking about somebody who practiced cannibalism. They found people practicing cannibalism, they put them to death for it, right? Jeffrey Dahmer was passive-aggressively put to death. He got thrown into a prison situation where he was going to get killed, right? Like we didn't just execute him, but so that honestly has been most of the answer, right? I think it is possible, and there are stories, pious stories, that someone even that far gone can, and with God all things are possible, can repent and come to Christ. So if you have the option of isolating that person in a way that they can no longer commit those crimes, but giving them time to potentially repent, that would be a good option, right? But of course, when we're talking about the late Bronze Age, the Israelites coming into Canaan, they don't really have an incarceration option, right? That's not right? And the wording is, we're going to see this wording in Deuteronomy and in Joshua. And people who just want to find this abhorrent in modern days don't go into this level of detail. But a lot of times it doesn't say like you've got to wipe out them per se. It says you've got to put an end to the abominations of these groups, right? And we also have to understand that what made you a member of one of these groups Again, they don't have any concept of DNA. It's not ethnicity, right? They didn't have the modern concept of ethnicity. What made you part of these groups was ritual participation, right? So think about what made you an Israelite. It was not being biologically descended from Abraham or any of Jacob's sons. What made you an Israelite is if you were male, you were circumcised, right? If you're female, you're either married to a circumcised husband or the daughter of a circumcised man, right? And you ate the Passover. That's what made you an Israelite. So similarly, what made you an Amalekite were you participated in the Amalekite initiation rituals and you participated in their ongoing sacrificial ritual pagan worship, which involves cannibalism, which involves this kind of ritualized sexual immorality, right? So if all of those people stopped doing those things and went and got circumcised and ate the Passover, there would be no more Amalekites. Problem solved, right? But if you have a person, like our hypothetical cannibal neighbor, who refuses to stop, who says, I will not stop, right, like, refuses, what's the other option, especially in the late Bronze Age? Right? Then they have to be put to death, right? So they're not being put to death as a punishment for the crimes they've committed. There's forgiveness available for the crimes they've committed if they repent, right? They're being put to death to prevent the crimes they insist on committing in the future, right? And that's why God orders them that they have to be gotten rid of. No more victims, right? They're not going to be allowed to hurt any more people. God wouldn't be just and compassionate if he just let the wicked run roughshod, right, over innocent people continuously and never intervened. Right? So yeah, that's part of what's going on there. And the ultimate proof that someone can leave one of those groups is Caleb, one of the two righteous spies. Caleb's a Kenizzite. That's one of those groups that they're going to wipe out the Kenizzites. And Caleb, when we first meet him, is identified as a Kenizzite in the Torah, but by the end of his story in Joshua, he's one of the elders of the tribe of Judah. Guess what? They didn't suddenly discover that he was descended from Judah biologically. But not only is he an Israelite, he's a member of a specific tribe, and not only is he a member of that specific tribe, he's one of the leaders, right, in that tribe. So the reality is, Israel in the Old Testament is very much like Israel in the New Testament, meaning the church, right? What makes you a Christian? You've been baptized and you received the Eucharist, right? Doesn't matter who your parents are, what country you're from, right? Anything else. If you're baptized and you receive the Eucharist, you're a Christian. If you're not baptized, you're not a Christian, right? If you don't receive the Eucharist for long enough, according to our canons, you're no longer a Christian. You're lapsed, which is a different status, and you have to be readmitted into the church when you come back. And we hope you come back and get readmitted and receive the Eucharist again, right? But in the same way that ancient Israel, right? If you're not circumcised, you're not an Israelite. And if you are circumcised, but you don't celebrate the Passover for a year, you're not an Israelite anymore, and you've got to come back and be reconciled. So it's very similar. It's not that it was ethnic in the Old Testament and then stopped being ethnic. It was never ethnic. Right.
So you mentioned Amalekites. So Amalekites and Amorites, two totally different clans, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Two groups.
Just wanted to clarify that. Secondly, when you read in Numbers and then in Deuteronomy, which is kind of recapping some things that happened in Numbers, it is often worded that the Lord delivered the enemies up to Israel. Mm-hmm. What are we to understand of that? I mean, you have this desert-dwelling nomadic tribe. What kind of weapons did they have compared to these mighty men of old, so to speak, that were a giant clan that stationary? They had they had weaponry. You know, did the Israelites have weaponry as they were?
No.
What?
That's why they're scared. Yeah. So that's, I mean, really, it's why they're scared. And even if we remember way back in the life of Moses, when they first came out of Egypt, God says to Moses, "Don't try and take them up the coast, because if you try and go up the coast, you're going to run into the Philistines. They're going to see the Philistines and they're going to panic." Right? Because God knows that's what would happen. Right? Now, the idea is, what God keeps telling them is, if you're living righteously, which means living in accordance with that order, with God's order, right? Which also is also what it means to be blessed, right? When you're in line with God's ordering of things, His creation, you are blessed. If you get out of line with that, you are cursed. That's what blessed and cursed means, right? Like as states, right? If they're in the right order with God, right, doing what they're supposed to be doing, everyone's in the right place, doing the things they're supposed to be doing, all of that, then God says He will go and defeat the enemy for them. Right? It's not, "I'll make sure you win." It's not, "I'll make sure you win." It's, "I'll win. I'll go take," right? I'll deliver them into your hand, right? I will hand them to you, right? And you can take them out, right? I will set it up and you can spike it, right? Like that's the, right? But then He says, if things are wrong, right, then doesn't matter what you've got, you're hopeless. And this becomes an important issue later in the history of Israel, because the Israelites are going to keep wanting to form these treaties and alliances with their pagan neighbors, right, to try to protect themselves from some other nation they perceive as a threat. And God's going to say to them, "Why are you trusting them? They're not like you," right? And you're not supposed to be like them. It's like, trust me. Right? That they just need God with them. They don't need a coalition of other pagan nations with them. Right? So that's what's going on there. Now, in terms of the concrete thing of what are they fighting with, so at this point in history, nobody really has a standing army. Right? A standing army is not a thing. No nation could really do that. In a nation like Egypt, that's basically the equivalent of a superpower, right? At this time in history, they would have, so Pharaoh would have generals who were full-time generals. Their job was to plan for war, right? So they're professional soldiers, these high-ranking officers, right? But when it came time to go to war, there was not a standing army. They would just call up all the men between a certain age. Who are able-bodied, right? And so that meant, that's why you'll see references in the Old Testament to like the time of war arriving, or the time to go into battle, the time when nations make war, and you're like, what, like 5 o'clock on Wednesday that we all go to war, right? But no, that was the time of the year, right? So you couldn't call up all the men of that age like during the harvest, because then your people wouldn't have food that year, right? Or during the planting season, right? So there are times a year when you needed all those people working on the farms, right? So then after the harvest, everything's harvested, you start to get into winter, right? You don't need the farm labor. Now you can call them up and go attack your neighbor or shore up your, right? And so because everybody's an agrarian economy, everybody's making war at the same time, right, of year, because of that. And the people who got called up would just have whatever they had. So a lot of them are just using wooden clubs and things like that. Some of them are using farming implements, like sickles, right? And that kind of thing, slingshots, right? Like slings. They're using just whatever, staves, whatever they have, they're fighting with. When you get a little technologically better, they had what were called sickle swords, which are literally sickles for farming that were hammered into swords, just straightened out a little bit. So you could use them as a sword in battle. That's why Isaiah has that image. Gets translated to English in the King James as they'll beat their swords into plowshares because there won't be any war anymore. That's what that image is. They'll take those and turn them back into farming implements because they won't need weapons anymore. Right. But yeah, so Israel especially, right? We're not talking, they probably didn't even have a lot of sickles and farming implements because they're not farming. So we're probably talking about sticks, clubs, staves, right? Mostly wood, and that kind of thing, right? Maybe a few people have some things they took from Egypt, right, when they were on their way out that may or may not be doing too great after 40 plus years. But yeah, and so they are being called upon to have a great amount. They are going up against a vastly superior enemy on a logistical level, right? Both in numbers in the army and equipment and all of that. But God is saying, you don't have to worry about that because I will fight for you. But that's part of the whole dynamic that goes on with the spies coming back and being like, we can't do this. And then all the people going, yeah, that's right, we can't do this, forget it. Yes, sir.
Yeah, this is just, I know this might be like a tad off topic, but when I'm reading like the Psalter, for example, this kind of goes back to earlier where we were talking about Mount Hermon, Mount like Horeb, all these different like kind of mountains in that, in the Middle East. I was curious because sometimes in the Psalter they mention like, you know, obviously when they're talking about like Mount Zion or the city of David, that's talking about Jerusalem, right? But sometimes they mention Mount Zalmon, like Zalmon is the way they spell it in English. I was just curious if, I don't know anything about, does that like represent something like in the Psalms when they're mentioning, is that a mountain or a people or a region like Zalmon?
Yeah, usually those are compass points.
Oh, okay. I was, okay.
With Mount Zalmon doesn't have a ton of stuff associated with it
Oh, okay.
in terms of biblical stories, but it's usually mentioned with other mountains to kind of give you, to designate an area.
Okay,
Like
so
from
maybe
this
it could be
mountain to
saying,
that
like, from
mountain,
here
from
to
that
here,
mountain to the
this
next
is-
mountain.
Okay, yeah.
To give you an idea of like the whole land,
Okay.
right? Yeah. Yeah. So we're at the end of our time, but we're in a weird place to stop. But we'll go ahead. We'll go ahead and stop here. We can pick up in the middle of chapter 1 next month. We can do a couple more questions. If people have a few more questions, I can hang out and do a few more questions. I'm not in a hurry. But
Sure.
yes, sir.
Let me regain what I was going to say. You were talking about earlier, you're Christian if you take the Eucharist and if you get baptized. And,
Yeah. In the other order, but yeah.
Or yeah.
Yeah.
And so I have a follow-up question after this, but what is the exact definition of a Christian?
Well, it depends on for what purposes we're defining Christian.
Because,
So what I was referring to
Yeah.
is there's a canon in the Orthodox Church. Which is a rule. There's a rule in the Orthodox Church that to be considered a Christian in good standing, right, rather than lapsed, you have to have been baptized and you have to receive the Eucharist at least once a year, specifically at the Passover, because they're getting that from the Torah, where you had to be circumcised to eat the Passover, right? So you have to be baptized. You have to receive the Eucharist at least once a year on Pascha, on the Passover. If you don't do that, then you are considered to be lapsed, and you have to be re-reconciled to the church. Now, is somebody who is lapsed not a Christian? Again, it depends on for what purpose you're asking the question, right? So if you want to say they're a Christian in bad standing for some reason, right? Like, okay, but people also use the word Christian to mean totally different things, right? So like there are people now, like Richard Dawkins, who's an atheist, says he's a cultural Christian. Meaning even though he's an atheist and doesn't believe in God, let alone the Christian God, right? He generally believes in a lot of values culturally, like ethics and ethical principles and things that come from Christianity. And he's acknowledging those came from Christianity. he lives according to those, right? So he's a cultural Christian, right?
The thief on the cross is something I thought of where he didn't do either of
Yeah.
the Eucharist or baptism, but Jesus said he will be in
Yeah.
paradise. So do you have to be Christian to go to heaven?
No.
Okay.
And being a Christian doesn't mean you go to heaven.
Okay.
Yeah, don't misinterpret what I just said. You getting baptized and receiving the Eucharist once a year will not guarantee that you go to heaven. Right? Because there's a lot of days in between, that once a year you're receiving the Eucharist where you could be doing a lot of things, right? And where, right, just the bare fact that you did those two things. In fact, that one time you received the Eucharist, you could be eating and drinking judgment on yourself, depending on how you're living your life, right? So, yeah, so I know in the way American folk, because we're a Protestantized culture, the way we talk, there are three different ideas that in that Protestant way of speaking, the Venn diagram is just a circle, right? And that is being a Christian, right? Being saved, and being a member of the church. So for a lot of Protestants, that's a Venn diagram. The Venn diagram is just a circle. You're either all three of those or you're none of those, right? I don't think you can back that up remotely with the Bible. Those are three different things. Now, all three can be true of you, right? But it's also possible that some of those could be true and not others. Okay? So, there are people who I would say you could fairly attribute the title Christian to, who are not members of the church. Because when I say the church, I mean the Orthodox Church, Christ's church on this earth, right? There are people, and I'm following St. Augustine in saying this, and he's a saint and a father of the church according to the Fourth Ecumenical Council, so neener. Right? There are people who can rightly be called Christians who nonetheless are outside of that institutional, or the actual church, which is the Orthodox Church. And we know for a fact that there are people who find salvation who are neither members of the church nor Christians. Okay? Emperor Vespasian's one of them, who found salvation through the prayers of St. Gregory the Dialogist. Okay, so that happens, right? Or the thief on the cross, right? He was never part of any institutional body of the church, right? Because there kind of wasn't one. We're not even told he was an Israelite. We're not even told ethnically what he was, right? We don't know if he was circumcised or not, right? We don't know if he ate the Passover or not, right? So, may very well have not been a member of the church, right? But was a Christian in that sense, right? Found salvation, right? I don't know if we even call him a Christian. I mean, sort of, right? But there have been, and we see this in the Old Testament already. There are people who aren't Israelites, right, who worship the God of Israel. Naaman the leper, Melchizedek, Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, right? But they never become Israelites. They're not even told to become Israelites. So they're not circumcised. They don't eat the Passover, right? So these three things are not totally coextensive. Okay? When I talk about it, like I said, when I say the church, I mean the Orthodox Church, because it's the church Christ established on earth, right? But I don't think if you're not a member of the Orthodox Church that you're going to hell, right? That you can't find salvation. That's not my business. Again, that's God's business. God knows, right? Nor do I say that if you are a member of the Orthodox Church, you're for sure going to find salvation, right? There have been plenty of horrible people who were baptized, right? Who ended up being horrible people. Stalin was a seminarian, for Pete's sake. Okay? He went to an Orthodox seminary. He received the Eucharist. He was baptized. Okay? Like, I'm not saying Stalin is a saint, right? Clearly not, right? And when I say Christian, I personally reserve that for people who accept the Nicene Creed. I think if you accept the Nicene Creed, not some version of, not some explanation of, because Mormons try to say, oh, we believe kinda. It's like, yeah, no, you don't, right? Like, as it was originally intended, if you accept the Nicene Creed, I could say, okay, right, like, you're a Christian. That doesn't make you a member of the church. That does, I can't rule on whether you're going to find salvation or not, right? But that's who I call a Christian. And in terms of who finds their salvation, God knows, I don't know. Right? I'm sure there are people who I think are very holy, pious people who secretly aren't. And I'm sure there's people who I look at and might judge in my thoughts who are actually great saints and much holier than me. It's not hard to be much holier than me, but right. So I don't know that, right? I can't rule on that third one at all. But so yeah, we've got to separate those. And unfortunately, even my definition of accepts the Nicene Creed is vanishingly few non-Orthodox Christians these days. And I consider that sad. Because if someone's not going to be a member of the Orthodox Church, I'd rather they at least be as close as possible. Because I think that gives them better odds of being able to work out their salvation. But, I mean, I've said on Lord of Spirits, William Lane Craig is not a Christian. He doesn't believe anything in the Nicene Creed is true. He doesn't believe in the Trinity. He doesn't believe in the dual nature of Christ. You know, I don't care how famous he is in evangelical circles or how respected. He may be a very smart guy, philosophically very sound. He's a practitioner of some religion, but that religion isn't Christianity as it's existed for the last couple thousand years. But at the same time, I know plenty of good, pious people who have never heard of the Orthodox Church in their life, but who spend every day of their life following Jesus as best they can. And I don't think God is going to send them to eternal torment because they never managed to discover the Orthodox Church exists. If anything, I think I'm going to have to give an account on the day of judgment for why I didn't do more to let those people know it existed. I'm the one who's going to get judged for that, not them. Right? Like, that's a bigger problem. So any other questions? I don't want to end on a down note. Somebody asked about comic books or TV or something, movies. Yes, sir.
It's not going to be about comic books.
Is it at least semi-upbeat?
That one says,
Oh, go ahead.
well, yeah, I mean, that's a good, so I'm the first person in my family, friends, to become Orthodox. I pretty quickly got over like the Orthodox zeal of trying to tell everyone why they should become Orthodox and like why they're dumb for not being, like that whole,
Yeah.
one of those things. And I quickly realized it's never, this doesn't seem to be going well every time I talk about this.
It's neither aesthetically pleasing nor practically useful.
Yeah, no. Yeah. So even this week though, like I have a couple of buddies who are, Protestant, but I think the question that they want to know is, so is it, like we would say, hey, believing in Jesus is a matter of, well, but you kind of just said like, well, I don't know what you said technically. You said there's a Venn diagram, but let's just say for the sake of this argument, like believing in Jesus is the line, let's say, for Protestants anyway, like you have to believe and
For
confess.
them. Yeah.
Believe and confess Jesus, that's a heaven and hell line. And so they ask me, sort of.
Yeah, sort of sometimes.
So they ask me, so are you saying that joining the Orthodox Church is a heaven or hell line? And I'm like, I don't know, it's a good question.
The correct answer is no.
Okay.
Joining
no.
the Orthodox Church is not the heaven-hell line.
Okay.
right?
But
Either
to-
way,
but to
there are
them-
members of the Orthodox Church who will
Sure,
not find
sure.
salvation.
But to them, that means, so it doesn't matter if I become, like, so then I shouldn't, so then it just doesn't matter if I become Orthodox, so cool, I'll stay where I am.
No.
Well, that's what I'm
Right,
saying,
yeah,
that's
yeah,
like,
yeah.
that's where they sort
Yeah.
of go with that.
Have you heard about the turkey sandwich?
I've heard about turkey sandwiches.
Okay, so this is my analogy, right? Where we're talking about other people who would fall into that category of Christians, right? This doesn't work with anybody else, right? This only works with those people who are sincere, like a person who's sincerely trying to follow Christ as best they can, as best they know how. They may have been taught some very bad ways of doing that, right? But they're doing their best, right? So it's like they've got a turkey sandwich, and it is a good turkey sandwich, right? Fresh bread, right? The turkey is fresh, it's juicy, it's moist. All the trimmings, right? Everything on it is good. It's nutritious, it's filling, right? They enjoy the sandwich, okay? But what I'm here to tell them is that in the next room, there's a whole Thanksgiving dinner, right? It's the same turkey, but a lot more of it, right? And all the fixins and the bread, all those things, plus more, right? And the fullness of the things that you have, right? You've got little bits of it, but there's a fullness to it, right? And there's more besides. And all of that is waiting for you there. So why would you settle for the turkey sandwich? It's not that there's something wrong. The turkey sandwich isn't poison, right? If they're Mormons, it's poison. But it's not, right? It's not. The turkey sandwich isn't poisonous, right? It's not going to kill them, right? But there's so much more, and so much more fullness, and so much more richness, right? Why would you settle for less? Right? If they need more explanation, you say, why would you not want to know, if you love Christ, why would you not want to know him more deeply? Why would you not want to have a better understanding of who he is and what he's done for you? Why would you just be like, I got my fire insurance, I'm not going to go to hell, I'm good. I'll settle for this, I don't want any more. No more Jesus for me, thanks. I hit quota. Right? And if they honestly say that, then they're not one of those sincere people I was talking about, right? They're just somebody who's had kind of a be scared of going to hell pathology beaten into them, but they're not actually, they don't love Jesus, they just are scared of dying, right? And if you find somebody who's in that position, then you got to talk about a whole different thing, right? Because you got to get them to move from fear to love. But if they're already at the love point, right? If you love that turkey sandwich, then you're really going to love Thanksgiving dinner, right? And you're going to crave, you're going to want more, right? Yes, sir.
So then I was just going to say that, for the short period of time that I've known you, I see you at most services, certainly every Sunday. I would suspect that your friends have noticed a transformation in you since you have become Orthodox. And I would suggest that that's probably the best way, as opposed to our weak words and how to communicate the whys and wherefores, is what they see how your life has been transformed is the best way to demonstrate the virtues of our Orthodox Christian faith and why it is the full turkey feast and not just the turkey sandwich, right?
Yeah.
But
And that's what I tell people. That's what I tell people with family members. That's what I tell people, like if one spouse is coming into the church and the other one isn't interested for whatever reason, right? I say, don't talk to them about it. Just you become an Orthodox Christian, right? And when they see what happens with you, right? Or even if they hate, I've told this to people, family members who hate the Orthodox Church, because they've got some deep-bred Romophobia, right? And Romophobia is funny a lot of the time because it's just Protestants who hate Roman Catholics. But sometimes there are people out there who've been abused by the Roman Catholic Church, right? That's even beyond that, right? And so they've found some kind of shelter in some kind of Protestant group, and usually some kind of Protestant group that's as far from, zero rituals, zero vestments, zero anything, because all that sort of triggers their memories of the spiritual and sometimes other trauma they've been through, right? And even in those cases, right, I tell people, and this has happened with a couple of my family members, right, like, if over time they see transformation and change in you, that there's actually something happening, and it happens in stages. First you get, well, I guess you're some type of Christian. You're a weirdo Christian, but you're some kind of Christian, I guess, right? Like it sort of slowly sort of moves. But that's the real way to convince people, because we're not actually Protestants. The difference between me and a Calvinist is not that I believe different things are true. The difference between me and a Calvinist is I live a different way of life in the world than a Calvinist does, right? And so the only way to show that is by living that way of life. You can't just describe it in intellectual terms, right? Or argue about it. But yeah,
So,
continue.
I wanted to just kind of go back and touch on the point that Alex made about, do not judge lest you be judged. And then you went on to make some comments about, it's not up to us to save the world, or it's not up to us to make right everything in the world, or really, and I just want to hopefully put a finer point on that in the context of our Amen Brotherhood, right? Because we've heard many times from Father Hans, for example, we experience the love of God through our brother, through another man, and so what I'm saying is that as this community, as this brotherhood, I feel we are called to help each other, right? And to, in that way, help if a brother is struggling with this or with that, or is, obviously sinning and may not see it, or, to help, through this community, through this brotherhood, we help each other work out our salvation. And maybe speak to that in terms of how that's different than judging, or trying to make everything right in the world that we see. Does that make sense?
Right. So to judge, an element of that, right? So I say it's not your job to set your brother in order, right? Implied in that is the idea, because I mentioned, right, that's not your job, meaning you assert a kind of superiority over them when you approach them in that way. I am going to fix you. I am going to straighten you out, right? And so, and this is what we see with like one of the criticisms Christ has for the Pharisees, right? They're really good at labeling people sinners, right? and telling them all the horrible things they're doing and why they're bad, right? But there's no sort of back end to that. So Christ isn't criticizing and saying like, oh, those people aren't sinners. No, they're sinners, right? The Pharisees were right about that, right? But what Christ is trying to get through to them is that should inspire compassion in you, right? That should inspire in you the desire to try to help them, right? To try to build them back up, to try to elevate the way they're living, right? To try to show them a different way to live, right? That should inspire all of those things, right? But part of the reason it didn't inspire those things is that they had placed themselves in this superior position. Think of the Pharisee in the parable of the publican and the Pharisee. Thank you that I am not like other men, even like this right, tax collector over here, right? And so you can't help when you're up here and they're down here and you're yelling down at them, right? And so that's the second piece after you take care of the log in your eye, then help with the speck, right? It doesn't say take care of the log in your own eye and leave him with the speck, right? It says, right? So you work and you get yourself right, right? And then as you're doing that, not when that's completely done, right? Let me really antagonize some people. This is a place where I think Jordan Peterson's wrong in his 12 Rules for Life. Here we go, right? He says, yes, I don't care. He says in there, before you try to set the world in order, you get your own life. You get your own life in perfect order before you go out and try and change the world. Okay? First of all, you will never have your life in perfect order. Right? You don't wait till after. Once I have become a saint and I am sinless, then I will be able to help my brothers. No, that's another version of the same error. Once I am superior to them all, I will be able to help them. Right? So it's not after, it's as you are working on that. As you are judging yourself, right? As you are working on getting your own life in order, you also help those around you do it. One of the ways you help them is by doing it yourself. Because again, we think very individualistically, right? My sins don't just affect me. They affect my wife, they affect my parishioners, they affect my family members, right? Nothing I do, especially that's sinful, only affects me. And so if I actually get serious and start repenting of my sins and being healed, that's also going to affect all of those people right off the bat at the first level, right? They're all going to be helped by the fact that I'm not harming and grieving and sinning against them. And that I'm trying to make right all of those things that I've broken as I've been sinning against them all this time. Right? So that alone is going to start helping them. Right? It's going to start helping them. Second piece, I'm going to start learning a lot of things. Right? I don't quite go all the way with Socrates. I don't think all knowledge is self-knowledge, but I think all knowledge begins with self-knowledge. If you don't know and understand yourself, you don't know anything. And you don't understand anything. But as you start to know and understand yourself and how sin works in your life, and how temptation works in your life, and how repentance works in your life, right? Then you'll have a deeper understanding to offer to other people. Right? And you'll be able to understand what's going on in their life. That will help you not take that superior position. If I really understand the sin in my own life, when I encounter sin in your life, I'm not going to think myself superior to you because I'm going to know about my own. Right? The Pharisees didn't know about their own. They just knew about everyone else's. Right? So I have to come to know my own first. And then out of that self-knowledge comes, right, what St. James talks about, right? If you see a brother erring and you bring him back, right, this will cover a multitude of your sins. This will actually atone for your sins according to the New Testament, right? You helping an erring brother. But right after that, he says, but guard yourself, lest you also be tempted, right? Because this is another thing. If we try to help others, right, and we haven't dealt with any of our own sin, right, it's far more likely that we're going to end up getting dragged down with them than we're going to pull them up. Right? If I'm also drowning, I can't rescue you. Right? If I'm not a strong swimmer and I try to rescue you while you're drowning, it's more likely that we both drown than that I actually help. Right? So I have to acquire that strength, right? So it's a, and this is different than any other area of life. Right? And I've encountered this profoundly as a priest. Right? Like if you came to an exercise class or a weight loss class, and I walked out and said, I'm going to teach you how to do this, you would be like, I think I'm going to take a different class somewhere else. Right? Because it's like, you have not achieved this, and you're going to try and teach me? Right? But guess what? I'm a priest. I have parishioners who are holier than me, and more pious than me, and more spiritual than me, and I'm supposed to guide them. Right? So this is different than that. Right? Most other things like that, right? If you're going to teach, you have to have acquired some level of something first, and then you're imparting that to others. That's not how this works. Right? That's how it's at the same time. And the more deeply you're working on your own sin and repentance, the more you're going to help and be able to help the people around you deal with theirs. Right? It's a weird thing, right? Compared to those others, where it's not you acquire something and then you pass it on. It's as you learn, right? The others around you will learn also.
Thank you, Father, very much.
This will be the last question.
Short one.
No pressure.
Okay. As a catechumen, how would you recommend going about finding a spiritual father, just navigating this process in general?
Yeah. So I generally take the position that you should attempt to have your parish priest as your spiritual father. If for some reason that doesn't work out, and that doesn't mean anything bad about either person, right? Just like there are women who you could have a happy marriage with and women who you could not. Not because either of you is a bad person, just like the two of you being in that relationship would not work, right? Because you have different personalities, different ways of viewing the world, right? And that can happen between a priest and a parishioner sometimes, right? And priests, especially if they've been at it for a few years, but most priests in general don't have a lot of ego in that, right? In fact, they can often tell it's not really working, right? That it's not really jibing. So if you run into that situation, then it's a question of finding someone who you have regular access to. So a mistake people will make is they'll be like, oh, I need to find the most pious person I can find. So, like, I'm going to go on a trip somewhere like 7 states away to a monastery, and this monk seems super pious, so I'm going to make him my spiritual father, even though, like, I'm going to see him once every 3 years. Right? And, like, he's a monk, so he doesn't have the internet. That's not, you're not going to be able to get, you know, he may be just as pious as you think he is, right? He may even be a great spiritual father, but if you're not going to be able to see him and interact with him regularly, right, it's not going to work. So it's not about, because like I was just saying, it's not about having arrived, right? So it's not about that. It's not about like, oh, I have found the man without sin. He shall be my spiritual father. In fact, you shouldn't want that because he won't be able to identify with anything you're going through. Right? Find somebody who's a sinner like you who knows what they're talking about. But yeah, I think the default should be your parish priest because you have the most regular contact with them, normally, out of Orthodox clergy. And then if that doesn't work out for some reason, and there's times where that doesn't work out because like he's your dad or your uncle or something, and it's weird, right? So you go to someone else. Then find someone who's near enough by, right? Like if you live here, you know, a town over in either direction, you've got an Orthodox priest. So if it came down to it, right, there are a few possibilities if it didn't work out with your parish priest, who you could see on a regular basis and regularly interact with, and who could be sort of involved in your life and keep up with what's going on.
Thank you, Father.
Yeah.
Close with prayer. Give us a blessing.
I usually don't, but we can. I like it when the bishop comes to these because then I can make him pray. Christ our God, watch over your servants as they depart from this place. Guide and protect them as they travel. Bring us back again at the appointed time to glorify thy holy name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
drowned.
Kind of soft.
Yep.
And then my younger sister almost drowned both of us.
Probably